Welcome, sleepy traveler. Tonight, we're going to drift back in time to an era of castles and candlelight. But instead of knights or kings, we'll explore something far more ordinary, yet strangely comforting. How did medieval people keep their homes clean? Without soap. No pine-scented sprays, no antibacterial wipes. Just soot, straw, and a whole lot of elbow grease. So lie back, close your eyes if you like, and let's take a slow, soothing journey through the dusty corners of medieval housekeeping. In the quiet hum of medieval life, the word clean meant something very different than it does today. There were no neon-coloured sponges, no plastic spray bottles, no shelves lined with soap in the shapes of flowers or ocean waves. To be clean was not to be spotless, not to be sterile, but simply to be livable, to be tolerable, to be well enough. You see, people didn't aim for a shining, polished look. They aimed to keep illness away, to keep vermin under control, and to keep their homes in a state where life could carry on without discomfort. Clean was not an aesthetic. It was a condition of survival. The medieval home was a mixture of earth, wood, smoke, and straw. Floors were made of packed dirt or rough wooden planks. Walls were often whitewashed, but over time grew darkened by the smoke of fires. Roofs were thatched or tiled, and ceilings were low. Even the cleanest house would appear dim and dusty to our modern eyes, but to its occupants, a home that was regularly swept, aired out, and maintained was clean enough. Cleanliness was deeply tied to nature. People understood that dirt was a part of life. You walked through mud to reach your door. You cooked over an open fire. You slept under rafters where birds might nest. The goal wasn't to remove every speck of grime. It was to make sure it didn't become a problem. Mud could be swept. Ashes could be used to scrub. Bad air could be driven out with an open window or by burning herbs. There was also a spiritual element to cleanliness. Many believed that filth attracted evil, not just physically, but morally and supernaturally. A clean home was not just healthier, it was holier. The act of cleaning, then, could be a quiet ritual, a way to maintain order in a world that was often unpredictable, a way to keep misfortune, both natural and mystical, at bay. Housekeeping, in this way, was a kind of daily prayer, a repetitive rhythm, a way of saying, I care about my family, I care about this little patch of earth that shelters us, I care about keeping the chaos of the world just slightly more manageable. And though they didn't have soap as we know it, medieval people still knew the value of cleansing, washing hands before meals, shaking out bed linens, combing hair, brushing clothes. These small acts were not always about hygiene in the modern sense, but about routine, discipline, and care. They understood that a clean environment helped keep spirits calm, tempers in check, and neighbors pleased. Even the poorest homes followed some method of tidiness. A peasant's cottage might be humble, but it wasn't neglected. Ash from the hearth could be spread to dry a muddy floor. Straw could be replaced when soiled. Tools had their place. There was a dignity in maintenance, and a quiet pride in knowing that your home, however modest, was cared for with effort. Of course, in castles and manor houses, the standards could be slightly higher. Servants were tasked with constant upkeep, sweeping great halls, wiping down tables, and tending to rushes on the floor. But even here, the same principle applied. Cleaning wasn't about perfection. It was about prevention. Preventing rot, rats, smell, and sickness. And perhaps preventing the creeping feeling that the world was slipping out of your control. So when we look back and ask, how did they stay clean without soap? The answer lies not just in what they did, but in how they thought. Cleanliness wasn't a pursuit of purity. It was a quiet act of resistance against dirt, disorder, and decay. A slow, daily promise to keep going, no matter what. And in that sense, it wasn't boring at all. It was deeply human. The broom, though humble, was a quiet hero of the medieval household. It didn't gleam with polish or boast a clever design. It was usually crooked, a little scratchy, and often handmade from whatever natural materials were at hand. Yet in an age without vacuum cleaners or robotic helpers, it was one of the few tools that stood between a home and complete disorder. Most medieval brooms weren't like the tightly bound ones we think of today. They were rough, improvised bundles of twigs, straw, or stiff grasses, tied around a sturdy wooden handle, if there was a handle at all. In poorer homes, someone might just gather a fistful of birch branches, knot them with twine or a strip of hide, and begin to sweep. These early brooms were sometimes called besoms, and they weren't designed for beauty or longevity. They were made for purpose, to push the world out of your way, one sweep at a time. The materials used depended on the season, the region, and what was available. Birch twigs were popular because they were flexible, but strong. Heather, with its wiry stems, made for an excellent sweeping tool in some parts of Britain. In more agricultural areas, straw or stiff hay was used. In forested regions, people often repurposed small tree branches. There was no store to visit, no catalogue to order from. If you wanted a broom, you either made it yourself or you bartered for one from someone who could. Sweeping was a daily ritual, often done in the early morning or as dusk approached. Dirt floors had to be cleared of dust, scraps, and insect droppings. Wooden floors, if present, needed brushing to prevent build-up. In kitchens, crumbs attracted mice and rats, so it was especially important to keep those areas as tidy as possible. Even in castles and larger homes, sweeping was a constant task, performed by servants with their own well-worn brooms, usually working in silence, going room to room. But sweeping wasn't just for the floor. People used smaller brooms, or even just bundles of straw, to sweep out soot from fireplaces, dust from shelves, and even cobwebs from ceilings. Some households had long-handled brushes specifically for high corners, though these were rare. Most simply used stools or ladders, or did without, letting cobwebs linger until absolutely necessary. During colder months, sweeping became even more essential. Snow and mud were tracked in on shoes and boots, creating a messy blend of moisture and grime that could cause wooden floors to warp or attract pests. In rural homes, animals might share living space with humans, chickens, goats, sometimes even a pig or two, so the line between indoors and outdoors was a little fuzzy. The broom became a boundary keeper, restoring a bit of order after each day's march of mess. Interestingly, brooms also had a symbolic role in some cultures. In parts of Europe, they were believed to offer protection from evil spirits. People would lean a broom against a door to ward off unwanted guests, both human and supernatural. In folklore, witches were said to ride them, though this association came much later and was based more in myth than fact. Still, it shows that the broom, though simple, carried more meaning than we might expect. Children were often taught to sweep as one of their earliest chores. A well-swept floor showed discipline, care, and respect for the household. It was a small but visible way to contribute to family life. In wealthier homes, apprentices or younger servants might begin their service with the task of sweeping, learning humility and patience along the way. There was also a rhythm to sweeping, a sound, a motion, a calm repetition that could feel almost meditative. The scrape of twigs over packed earth, the soft whoosh of straw brushing the planks. For many, it was a time to think, to plan, or to simply be still. In a world without digital distractions, a broom in hand might offer one of the few moments of quiet focus available in a busy day. Over time, brooms would become more refined, handles would be sanded, twigs would be bundled more tightly, and eventually, commercial broom making would become a trade of its own. But in the medieval era, the broom remained beautifully simple, a tool made from the land, returning dust to dust. So while it may not gleam or beep or plug into a wall, the medieval broom was a faithful companion to the tired housekeeper, a symbol of ordinary care, woven from wood and patience. A daily partner in the long, slow battle against the creeping edges of chaos. Long before the invention of modern soaps, with their fragrant bubbles and colourful bottles, medieval people turned to the earth itself for their cleaning needs. They didn't think of cleanliness in terms of germ-killing power or laboratory-tested formulas. Instead, they relied on materials that were rough, natural, and sometimes surprisingly effective, things like ash, sand, and even dirt itself. To our modern sensibilities, it might sound strange, using dirt to clean dirt. But in the medieval world, the goal was not to sterilize, but to scour. Smoothness, not sparkle, was often the aim. Grease on a pot, soot on a hearthstone, residue from meat or vegetables on a chopping block. These weren't washed away with perfumed liquids, but rubbed off with gritty materials that scratched and lifted the mess away. Wood ash was one of the most common and versatile cleaning agents. It was always in supply. Every household had a hearth or fire, and every fire produced ash. Rather than throwing it out, people collected it in buckets, storing it for various purposes. Ash had natural alkaline properties, which made it useful for breaking down fats. When mixed with water, it could form a rudimentary kind of lye. This alkaline solution, though rough on the hands, was effective for scrubbing cookware, cleaning surfaces, and even laundering clothes. Ash mixed with a bit of water was often used to make a paste. This greyish slurry could be smeared onto iron pots, then rubbed in with a rag or a clump of straw to help remove stuck-on food. It also helped to neutralize odors. A pan that had cooked fatty meat or a stew full of onions could be deodorized with a quick ash rub. And because soap was rare, expensive, or entirely unavailable for most people, this became the standard way to clean. Sand was another favored tool, especially in coastal regions or places with access to rivers. Fine sand had an abrasive texture that could strip away grime with just a bit of pressure. Wooden floors might be scrubbed with sand and a stiff brush or broom, grinding dirt into dust and leaving behind a smoother surface. It was also scattered on floors to soak up grease or spills, particularly in kitchens or workshops. After it had done its job, the soiled sand was simply swept away and replaced with clean material. In some households, sand was mixed with a little vinegar or water and used to polish metalware. Pewter goblets, bronze plates, and iron tools could all be made to gleam, not through chemicals but through persistent scrubbing. Sand, in this sense, was not only a cleaner but a mild polisher. Though it left behind a slightly scratched surface, that was often better than one coated in soot or fat. There were also cases where people used plain, dry earth. Clay-rich soil, when sifted and dried, was thought to absorb oils and odours. A wooden table might be sprinkled with fine dust and then rubbed down with a cloth. While this wouldn't create a hygienic surface by modern standards, it did help remove residue and dampness. In areas where ash or sand was hard to find, this earthy method was the next best thing. Cleaning tools varied widely. A piece of old linen, a worn bit of leather, or even a sheep's wool rag might be used to rub and polish. Sometimes a person would simply use their hands, especially when working with gritty materials. It wasn't always comfortable. Ash and sand were drying and could irritate skin, but it was effective enough for the job at hand. The idea of a clean kitchen or clean floor was about the absence of visible filth, not the unseen bacteria we now worry about. A floor that had been scrubbed with ash and swept with a broom was considered well kept. A pan that no longer smelled of last week's meal was ready to use again. There was a kind of satisfaction in knowing that, with just a handful of sand and a bit of effort, the day's mess could be erased. In wealthier households, specialized staff might be assigned to handle these cleaning tasks. Scullery maids, for instance, would spend long hours hunched over basins, scrubbing pots with ash and grit until their knuckles ached. In smaller homes, these tasks fell to the woman of the house, or to older children who learnt the techniques from watching their elders. There were no shortcuts, just repetition and skill passed down from one generation to the next. Some clever folk even experimented with combinations. Ash mixed with salt, sand combined with vinegar, dirt sifted and then warmed slightly to absorb more grease. These were not written recipes, but rather inherited wisdom, learned by doing, adjusted by need. And while these mixtures lacked the fragrance and foam of modern cleaners, they held the deep practical logic of a time when every resource had to be used wisely. There was something strangely respectful in this approach. Medieval people worked with what they had. They didn't throw things away if they could be reused. Ash from the fire, sand from the river, dirt from the garden all found new life in the act of cleaning. It was part of a larger cycle: cook, eat, clean, burn, reuse. Nothing was wasted. Even the grime had a role to play. In the soft silence of those candlelit kitchens and hearth-warmed cottages, the gentle scraping of sand on wood, the dull rub of ash on iron, and the quiet rhythm of scrubbing cloths marked the passing of time. It was a world without chemicals, but not without care. And perhaps, in its simplicity, it offered a kind of peace, a slow, steady way of keeping chaos at bay, using only the humblest tools of the earth. In the medieval home, the floor was not just a surface to walk on, it was a living, breathing part of daily life. Unlike our modern obsession with hardwood shine or tiled perfection, most medieval floors were made of packed dirt, uneven wood, or worn stone. Cold, dusty, and often difficult to keep clean, they required an entirely different approach to hygiene and comfort. And so, into this world came an ingenious and beautifully simple solution: rushes. Rushes were long, grass-like plants gathered from marshes, riverbanks, and wetlands. Soft underfoot and easy to collect, they became the medieval answer to both carpets and floor cleaning. Once harvested, they were dried in the sun until they became pliable and fragrant. These bundles were then spread thickly across the floors of homes, especially in communal areas like the hall or kitchen. But rushes were more than just a soft place to walk. They served many practical purposes. In cold climates, they provided a layer of insulation between bare feet and icy ground. In times of illness or childbirth, they offered a cushioned, cleaner surface for lying down. And in daily life, they quietly absorbed crumbs, soot, mud, grease, and even spilled drinks. When someone tracked in dirt, the rushes caught it. When embers popped from the hearth, the rushes smothered the impact. In a strange way, they were both a sponge and a shield. The act of laying down rushes was not random. In wealthier homes and manor houses, floors might be artfully arranged with fresh-cut rushes in overlapping patterns, sometimes woven together or layered thickly for extra comfort. The selection of rushes, long, strong, fragrant ones, was part of the preparation. Sometimes, herbs were added to the mix: lavender, mint, chamomile, rosemary, marjoram. These aromatic plants released their scents when walked upon or disturbed, filling the room with gentle, pleasant smells that masked less delightful odors of daily life: cooking, sweating, animals, and fires. In some cases, the herbal additions were not just for the nose. People believed certain herbs could repel insects or even ward off illness. A floor layered with lavender and sweet flag was not only cleaner, it was safer. These beliefs weren't entirely unfounded. Some herbs did have mild antiseptic or insect repellent properties, but even where they didn't, the sensory experience, clean, calming scents in an otherwise harsh world, offered comfort that was worth the effort. Of course, over time, the rushes became soiled. Crumbs collected, liquids seeped in, and the pleasant smell faded. As the weeks passed, the once fresh floor covering began to feel gritty, soggy, or even moldy in places. Depending on the household's wealth and discipline, rushes might be changed every few weeks, every few months, or, in less fortunate cases, just once a season. In poorer homes, the rushes were rarely replaced entirely. Instead, fresh layers were simply added on top of the old, creating a thick, compressing mat of organic material. After a year or more, this could become an entire ecosystem of its own, housing insects, nesting mice, and fostering an odd sort of indoor wilderness. But for many, this was preferable to the raw coldness of a bare floor. It was a necessary compromise in a world where other forms of comfort were scarce. Cleaning these layered rushes wasn't easy. In wealthier homes with servants, the job of lifting, sweeping out and relaying fresh rushes fell to lower-ranking staff. It was dirty, exhausting work. The old rushes had to be shoveled out, often releasing a cloud of dust and odor. The floor underneath would be swept, sometimes scrubbed with ash and water if wooden, and then a new layer of rushes would be brought in, carefully laid down, and sometimes perfumed with herbs once again. In grander settings like castles or abbeys, records show that rushes were changed in preparation for visits, holidays, or special events. Just as we might clean the house for guests, medieval households refreshed their rushes to create a clean and welcoming environment. It was a point of pride, a sign of care and hospitality. A sweet-smelling rush-covered floor was a subtle way of saying, "You are welcome here." Beyond function and comfort, rushes also played a role in ritual and symbolism. In some religious ceremonies or seasonal festivals, floors were strewn with particular herbs or flowers. On feast days, rushes might be sprinkled with rose petals or evergreens, transforming the home into something briefly sacred, or at least celebratory. Even in daily life, the presence of carefully laid rushes showed a household's sense of order, rhythm, and participation in the slow, cyclical care of domestic life. Children played on rushes, pets curled up in them, visitors tread them down as they ate, talked, or prayed. The floor wasn't something you kept distant, it was part of your life. It collected the traces of every day, a spilled stew, a dropped crust, the ashes of a burnt log, the soft imprint of a barefoot step after washing. In time, as cleaning methods evolved and flooring became more standardized, rushes slowly disappeared from the home. Wooden and stone floors were better sealed, rugs became more widespread, and soap became more accessible. But for hundreds of years, rushes were at the heart of medieval cleanliness, not in the sense of sterility, but in the sense of comfort, care, and the small daily acts that made life feel a little more livable. So, when we imagine the medieval household, it's worth remembering that the ground beneath their feet wasn't just dirt. It was a woven mixture of grass, memory, scent, and survival. It was a patchwork of the seasons. It was where cleanliness began, not with soap, but with softness. In the dim interiors of medieval homes, where candles flickered against soot-darkened walls, and hearth fires were the center of life, something strange and almost magical occurred. The very thing that darkened and dirtied their homes, smoke, also helped keep them clean. In a world without disinfectant sprays, antiseptics, or air purifiers, Smoke played a quiet, unrecognized role as one of nature's original sanitizers. Most medieval homes did not have chimneys as we know them. Instead, the smoke from the fire rose and spread through the house, often drifting up toward a small hole in the roof or escaping through gaps in thatch or tiles. It lingered in the rafters, curled along the ceiling, and gently coated the walls in a thin layer of black soot. To modern eyes, this might seem like a problem. A house filled with smoke sounds more like a hazard than a help. But to medieval people, smoke was a part of life, and in its own quiet way, it offered certain benefits. First and foremost, smoke helped to preserve and dry out the structure of the home itself. In cold and damp climates, where wood could easily rot and mold could thrive, the constant presence of low-level smoke acted like a slow, invisible drying agent. It drew out moisture from the beams, the thatch, and the packed earth. It kept surfaces drier than they otherwise would have been, making it harder for mold, mildew, and certain bacteria to gain a foothold. In this way, smoke became an atmospheric cleaner, not by removing dirt, but by creating conditions in which certain forms of decay were slowed or stopped. The benefits extended to textiles and food as well. In many homes, meats and herbs were hung from the rafters to dry. The smoke rising from the hearth passed over them continuously, acting as a natural preservative. This same smoke also helped to keep pests, like insects and rodents, at bay. Fleas, mites, and certain beetles didn't thrive in smoky environments. The fine particles in the air, combined with the scent and the dryness, created an atmosphere that discouraged many household pests from making their home in the rafters or storage areas. Even bedding and clothing, often dried indoors on lines strung near the hearth, were infused with the smell of smoke. While to us this might seem unpleasant, to medieval people it was often preferable to the alternative, the rank odor of damp wool or mildew. A smoky garment was a dry one, and a dry one was a safer one. There was also an oddly cleansing effect that smoke had on the human body. Bathing was infrequent, especially in colder months when water had to be heated by hand and the risk of catching a chill was high. But sitting by a fire, wrapped in blankets and breathing in the smoke, warmed the body deeply and helped people sweat. Sweat, in turn, was seen as a form of natural cleansing. Combined with the mild antibacterial properties of certain types of wood smoke, especially from burning herbs or aromatic woods, this process may have offered a rudimentary kind of detoxification, even if people didn't understand it in those terms. It wasn't uncommon for herbs to be deliberately added to the fire, not for their fuel, but for their fragrance and supposed health benefits. People tossed in bundles of dried sage, rosemary, juniper, or thyme, allowing the scented smoke to fill the room. This practice, often rooted in both folk medicine and spiritual belief, was thought to purify the air and ward off disease. In times of plague or widespread illness, homes might be kept full of smoke as a kind of invisible barrier between the sickness and the living. Whether this worked in any scientific sense is debatable, but the comfort it brought was real. Even the thick, blackened soot that smoke left behind on walls and ceilings wasn't always seen as a burden. In some cases, it formed a protective coating over the wooden beams of the house, sealing in tiny cracks and deterring insects that might otherwise burrow in. It darkened the color of the home's interior, yes, but it also gave the house a sense of age, character, and even authority. The blacker the rafters, the longer the fire had burned, the longer the family had lived there. Still, smoke was not without its drawbacks. Inhaling it daily could cause coughing, irritated eyes, and long-term respiratory issues. But in a time when choices were limited and practicality reigned supreme, its benefits often outweighed its discomforts. People simply adapted. They cooked low to the ground, sat near the hearth, and allowed the smoke to rise around them. They learned to live with it, to work with it, and, in some cases, to harness its properties. In monasteries and some larger homes, smoke was even used in a more deliberate and ritualistic way. Before a new room was put to use, it might be smoked or fumigated by burning aromatic herbs or resins, believed to drive out evil spirits or cleanse the space of illness. This practice, while spiritual in nature, also had the practical effect of airing out the room and filling it with pungent, drying smoke. Even religious ceremonies sometimes involved censers filled with burning incense, a symbolic act of purification with real-world antimicrobial smoke drifting through the air. In the end, smoke in the medieval home was both a burden and a blessing. It dirtied the walls but protected the roof. It stung the eyes but dried the air. It filled the lungs but emptied the house of fleas. It left behind a scent that clung to hair, clothes, and furniture, but also offered the faint comfort of warmth and familiarity. To those who lived in a time without chemical cleaners, electric fans, or climate control, smoke was a subtle, ever-present ally in the fight against decay, dampness, and disease. It was not just a byproduct of warmth. It was a quiet housekeeper, moving silently through the rafters, curling into corners, and keeping things, just barely, on the side of clean. In a world before central heating, ceiling fans, and air purifiers, the very air inside a home could feel heavy, thick, and stale. The flickering warmth of a fire might keep the cold at bay, but it also filled rooms with smoke, soot, and the smell of cooking, people, and animals. Medieval households, tightly enclosed and dimly lit, could easily become stuffy, damp, or unpleasant. And yet, even without an understanding of bacteria or airborne disease, people instinctively knew that air needed to move. That light and breeze, however fleeting, were as necessary as food or water. Ventilation in the medieval world was both an art and a habit, one shaped by architecture, weather, and a deep connection to the natural rhythms of life. The first and most obvious method was the use of windows, but these were not like the glass windows of today. In fact, most medieval windows had no glass at all. Instead, they might be open holes in the wall, covered with wooden shutters, animal skin, oiled cloth, or lattices of horn or parchment to let in light while keeping out wind and insects. In wealthier homes, small panes of translucent glass were used, but these were rare and extremely expensive. When the weather allowed it, windows were flung open wide, especially in the early morning when the air was freshest. The breeze would drift in and out, carrying with it the scent of grass, dew, smoke, and soil. People welcomed it, knowing instinctively that fresh air made a room feel better, even if they didn't know exactly why. A house that had been aired out was considered more wholesome. It felt lighter, clearer, more peaceful. On days of sunshine, homes were often opened from end to end, with cross breezes encouraged to sweep through corridors and chambers, lifting away the stale breath of the night. In cottages and rural dwellings, doors often served a dual function. Left ajar, they allowed for both light and air. Children and animals came and went freely, and the air followed. In homes with multiple rooms or a loft above the main hall, small vents or slatted panels were sometimes built into the walls or gables to allow rising heat and smoke to escape. Though primitive by modern standards, these features reflected a thoughtful approach to airflow. Of course, not all ventilation came from design. Much of it came from daily behavior. Bedding was shaken out and hung in the sun when possible. Blankets were draped over fence posts or hedges. Even heavy woolen garments were sometimes aired on dry days to freshen them. Kitchens, where smoke and grease clung to every surface, were often located near doors or openings to the outside. The smells of cooking and the heat of the hearth could be overwhelming, and so cooks learned to ventilate through sheer necessity, propping open shutters, hanging cloths that billowed with the wind, and sometimes even constructing kitchens as separate outbuildings to keep smoke and heat away from the living quarters. Sunlight was also a vital part of medieval homekeeping. It was known, even if not scientifically understood, that sunlight made rooms feel cleaner. People observed that mold and dampness clung more to dark corners, and that rooms bathed in light were less likely to smell foul or feel oppressive. On bright days, families might open every window they had, simply to let the sunshine wash over the floors, walls, and furnishings. It was a form of natural sterilization, silent and radiant. The power of light and air was also deeply symbolic. In religious tradition, darkness was associated with danger, sin, or illness, while light was a metaphor for purity and divine presence. Letting light into the home was both a physical and spiritual practice. In some cases, people would burn aromatic woods or herbs, not only to mask unpleasant smells, but to cleanse the air in a ritualistic sense. It was thought that bad smells carried disease, and by making the air fragrant, one could protect the home and body alike. Certain herbs, dried and hung in windows or tucked near door frames, were thought to purify the air. Sprigs of rosemary, bundles of thyme, or handfuls of lavender might be placed near openings to scent the incoming breeze. These plants were believed to ward off illness and misfortune, and their presence was as much about feeling safe as staying clean. Seasonal changes brought new challenges and new habits. In winter, windows were shut tight, and fresh air was a luxury. Homes grew smoky and close, and the need for ventilation was often in conflict with the need for warmth. People might crack a window briefly or open the door just long enough to draw in a breath of cold, crisp air before sealing it shut again. In summer, however, the doors stayed open for hours, and air flowed more freely. Laundry was hung outdoors, straw beds were taken apart and shaken. Even cooking was sometimes done outside to keep the house from overheating. In some places, homes were built with small openings high up in the walls or thatched roofs that allowed hot air to escape. These were primitive forms of ventilation, but effective. The rising smoke and heat created natural currents that drew in cooler air from lower openings. People may not have had words like airflow or ventilation, but they knew how to feel for it. They knew when a room was too still, too close, too full of old breath and bad scent. And while none of these methods could truly sanitize a room by today's standards, they worked within the rhythms of life at the time. A home that was regularly open to the elements, that welcomed wind and sun, was a home that breathed. It was a home that felt more alive. Even the animals knew it. Cats would curl up in sunbeams. Dogs would sprawl in the path of a draft. Chickens wandered in and out of open doors, fanning the air with their feathers as they went. Ventilation wasn't mechanical, it was organic. It flowed with the seasons, the weather, and the habits of the people who lived in these homes. And though it may seem primitive to us now, there's something beautiful in its simplicity, something wise in the way medieval people worked with nature instead of trying to seal it out. They knew that a clean home wasn't just about washing or scrubbing. It was about air that moved, light that warmed, and a house that, in its own quiet way, could breathe. Washing clothes in the medieval world was not a weekly task done with the push of a button. It was a major undertaking, often stretching across entire days, sometimes involving multiple people, and always demanding physical labor, patience, and planning. Soap, as we know it, scented, foaming, gentle on hands and fabrics, was largely unavailable or unaffordable for the average person. Yet, even without it, people found ways to clean their garments, using the humble, harsh tools that nature provided. Clothing was valuable. People owned far fewer garments than we do today, and many wore the same outfit day after day, sometimes for weeks before washing it. Outer garments, like woolen tunics or cloaks, might be brushed or shaken out rather than laundered. Washing was reserved for linens and undergarments, anything that lay close to the skin and absorbed sweat, oils, and dirt. These were usually made of rough linen or hemp cloth, which could withstand repeated washing, scrubbing, and exposure to sunlight. The first step in the process was soaking. Garments were submerged in water, usually from a river, stream, or well, and left to soften. But soaking alone didn't clean the fabric. To break down the oils and grime, medieval people turned to one of the harshest natural substances they could produce: lye. Lye was created by pouring water through ashes, often collected from the household hearth. The resulting liquid was alkaline, caustic, and smelled strongly of wood smoke. It was a rudimentary detergent, strong enough to break down fats, but also harsh enough to burn skin if not handled carefully. Soaking clothes in lye was not for the faint of heart. After garments had absorbed the lye, they were beaten, sometimes on flat stones by riversides or in wooden tubs using paddles, sticks, or even fists. The idea was to agitate the fabric enough to release the dirt, sweat, and oils caught in its fibers. This process was noisy, wet, and exhausting. But it worked. The combination of soaking, alkaline solution, and physical force lifted away the filth of everyday life, leaving the garments cleaner, if not entirely refreshed. Water quality played a big role in how clothes were washed. In rural areas, streams and rivers were often used directly. In towns, public washing areas, called washhouses, were sometimes built, where women gathered to do laundry together. These were social spaces, filled with chatter, gossip, and laughter, but also with the rhythmic slapping of wet cloth on stone. Water was usually cold, though on special occasions, such as preparation for a feast day or after illness, it might be heated over fires to improve the cleaning process. After washing, clothes were wrung out by hand. There were no wringers, no spin cycles. Large items like sheets or cloaks could be especially heavy, and squeezing them required strength. They were then hung to dry, usually outside, draped over hedges, tree branches, fences, or wooden frames. Sunlight was seen as a natural purifier. It bleached fabric slowly over time and helped remove lingering odors. In colder months, clothes might be dried indoors near the hearth or in lofts, but this often slowed the process and left garments smelling of smoke. Interestingly, medieval people sometimes added fragrances or softening agents to their laundry, though these were modest compared to modern fabric softeners. Sprigs of herbs like lavender, rosemary, or thyme might be boiled in water and used as a final rinse to leave a pleasant scent. In some cases, people would store clean linens with dried herbs to keep moths away and maintain a fresh smell. These little touches were more common in wealthier homes, but even peasant families knew the value of good-smelling clothes. Washing was also shaped by the seasons. In winter, it was much harder to do laundry. Water had to be thawed or carried long distances, and drying was slow. As a result, many people simply delayed washing until spring, airing out garments and shaking them clean instead. During warmer months, however, laundry became part of the weekly or bi-weekly rhythm of rural life. Entire days might be set aside for it, with families working together to scrub and dry their limited supply of clothing. There were also rituals and superstitions attached to washing clothes. In some areas, it was considered unlucky to do laundry on certain days of the week, particularly Fridays or Sundays. Others believed that washing clothes during a thunderstorm would invite bad luck or misfortune. These beliefs were rooted in folk traditions and spiritual caution, but they often aligned with practical concerns. After all, who wants to hang laundry when a storm is coming? Wealthier individuals could afford to send their laundry out. Washerwomen, often poor women working for little pay, would collect garments from noble houses and wash them in large batches. These women were skilled, though their work was backbreaking. They knew how to treat different fabrics, how long to soak them, when to beat them, and how to dry them without damaging the weave. In return, they were often paid in bread, leftover food, or small coins. Their labor kept the upper classes in clean linen, though they themselves usually wore the most worn and ragged clothes. Despite the effort involved, clean clothing was a source of pride. A crisp, white shirt, a well-laundered apron, or a freshly dried tunic signaled order, dignity, and self-respect. Even among peasants, a family that kept its clothes in good condition was viewed with admiration. Cleanliness wasn't about fashion. It was about discipline, health, and care. There were, of course, limits. Some stains never came out. Some fabrics wore thin from repeated washing. But even so, the attempt to keep clothes clean, using only ash, water, and sheer human effort, was a testament to the medieval commitment to hygiene in a world without modern comforts. So when we imagine medieval life, it's easy to picture dirt and grime. But behind the scenes, someone was always washing, soaking, scrubbing, and drying, relying on ancient knowledge, shared labor, and the natural power of ash and sun. Even without soap, they found a way to make their clothes clean again. Not with ease, but with persistence. And in that daily labor, there was something quietly noble, something enduring. In the medieval world, the home was not always a sanctuary from nature. It was part of nature, a space where humans lived side by side with the elements, the seasons, and often the creatures that crept, scurried, or slithered through the dark. Mice rustled in the rushes. Insects fluttered near the hearth. Sometimes fleas or lice made a home in the seams of clothing or the folds of bedding. Cleanliness was not just about tidiness. It was a defense, a constant, quiet battle against the intrusion of vermin. Unlike modern homes, which are sealed and insulated with layers of protective materials, medieval dwellings had cracks, gaps, and open spaces. Doors were often little more than wooden planks, loosely fitted. Windows, when they existed, were usually just shuttered openings without glass. Thatched roofs, while warm and practical, were havens for birds, insects, and even small rodents. In rural cottages, animals like goats, chickens, or pigs might live indoors, especially during the winter months. This meant that the boundaries between human and animal, between inside and outside, were always porous. To cope with this, medieval people developed an array of methods, both practical and inventive, to keep vermin under control. One of their most loyal allies in this effort was the domestic cat. Cats were common across medieval Europe, valued not as cuddly pets, but as fierce, capable hunters. A good cat could keep a house nearly free of mice and rats, especially in places where food was stored openly, like pantries, root cellars, or granaries. These animals were so important that some households might keep multiple cats and even pass them down as part of the estate. Cats worked silently, mostly at night. They prowled beams and rafters, slinked under benches, and kept watch near the hearth. They were not always treated with the affection we might assume today. In some areas, cats were associated with witches or seen as omens, particularly black cats, but their usefulness outweighed superstition. People fed them scraps, gave them shelter, and in return, expected them to keep the rodent population in check. In some households, cats weren't enough. Weasels, ferrets, or small terriers were sometimes used to hunt vermin, particularly in barns or larger storehouses. These animals, lean and relentless, could enter burrows and tight spaces where cats might not reach. In noble households, ferrets were occasionally trained and kept for this very purpose. Their presence might seem exotic to us now, but in a world where grain could mean survival and a single rat could spoil an entire sack of flour, every tool was considered. Birds of prey were also used in some cases, particularly in the castles or estates of the wealthy. Barn owls and falcons were encouraged to nest in towers or eaves. At night, they hunted silently, swooping through the darkness to pick off rats, mice, and even small snakes. Though not domesticated in the way cats were, these birds were seen as protectors of the home, their eerie calls echoing through the rafters like a natural alarm system. Aside from animals, there were many small, deliberate efforts to keep pests at bay. Floors were swept regularly, not just to remove dirt, but to disrupt the habitats of fleas, mites, and insects. Rushes on the floor were replaced or refreshed with herbs like pennyroyal, lavender, and tansy, plants believed to repel unwanted creatures. These aromatic additions were not simply for scent. They were a form of passive pest control, lining the floor with subtle barriers. Walls were inspected, particularly in the winter months when mice sought warmth. Gaps were stuffed with straw, cloth, or mud. In wealthier homes, gaps might be filled with wax or resin to seal them more thoroughly. Traps existed too, though they were rudimentary. Bowls were baited, nets were laid. Pits or buckets were sometimes used to catch mice, though this often required constant monitoring. Food storage was one of the greatest challenges. Without refrigeration, anything edible had to be protected from insects, rodents, and mold. Grain was stored in tightly lidded barrels or clay jars, sometimes suspended from the ceiling with ropes to keep it away from mice. Smoked meats were hung high, near the rafters, where smoke still curled and pests struggled to climb. Cheese and bread were kept in cabinets with perforated panels, what we might now call a pantry, though these cabinets were sometimes raised off the ground or hung against stone walls for extra security. The bed, that most personal and vulnerable place, was also a target. People slept fully clothed, under heavy wool blankets, sometimes on straw-filled mattresses. These materials, warm and organic, attracted fleas and lice. To prevent infestations, bedding was taken out on sunny days and shaken vigorously. Linen sheets were washed more often than outer garments, scrubbed with lye or ash, and laid out to dry in open fields. Mattresses were sometimes opened, refilled, or simply replaced with fresh straw. Despite all these efforts, vermin could never be entirely banished. They were part of life, unwanted but expected. Still, the ongoing effort to manage them was part of what made a household feel kept. It was a mark of diligence and pride to have a home that was relatively free of pests. And though many of these practices seem primitive to us now, they were rooted in careful observation and generations of hard-earned knowledge. What's most striking is that people didn't wait for things to become unbearable before acting. Their routines, sweeping, airing, layering herbs, watching for droppings or chewed grain, were all preventative. They understood that a home could either welcome or resist nature, and though the battle was never fully won, it was always being fought in the quiet way of daily life. So when we imagine a medieval cottage, smoky and dim, filled with the scent of wood ash and rosemary, it's worth remembering that it was also a place of constant vigilance. A place where cats crouched in corners, where dried herbs hung from beams, where people swept the floor not for appearance, but to guard against tiny invaders. Cleanliness in that world meant defense. and in every small, thoughtful act, they were drawing a line between the world they had built and the wilderness that always waited just beyond the door. In the medieval world, personal cleanliness was not merely a private concern, it was a public experience. While the concept of hygiene was vastly different from our modern expectations, people still sought out ways to wash themselves, refresh their bodies, and maintain some level of bodily cleanliness. And in towns and cities across medieval Europe, there was one place where this was made possible: the public bathhouse. Far from being a luxury only for the wealthy, bathhouses were surprisingly common, especially in urban centres. They were often communal, gender-segregated, or timed for men and women to bathe separately, and open to people from various walks of life. These bathhouses weren't quiet spa retreats. They were vibrant places of social interaction, full of the sounds of conversation, laughter, splashing water, and occasionally heated debates. They served not just as places of cleansing, but as hubs of community life. At the heart of every bathhouse was heat, lots of it. Water was heated in large cauldrons over open fires, then poured into wooden tubs or shallow pools. The steam filled the air, clinging to the walls and rising through the slats in the roof. Some bathhouses were elaborate, with multiple rooms for undressing, steaming, bathing, and resting. Others were little more than converted wooden sheds with basic facilities. Regardless of size, the process was essentially the same: undress, soak, scrub, rinse, and rest. Soap, again, was a rarity. Instead, people cleaned themselves with coarse cloths, handfuls of sand, or abrasive pastes made from flour, ash, or ground herbs. Olive oil or animal fat was sometimes used to loosen dirt and sweat, then scraped off with a flat tool called a strigil. This practice, borrowed from ancient Roman bathing customs, lingered in some areas and was revived in others. It may seem primitive, but it could leave the skin surprisingly refreshed. In wealthier regions, bathhouses might offer fragrant additions: rosewater, lavender, or citrus peels, added to the bath to enhance the experience. These were luxuries, but they were not unheard of. In certain medieval Islamic cities, for example, public hammams reached extraordinary levels of sophistication, with heated marble floors, domed ceilings, and attendants who massaged and scrubbed patrons with perfumed oils. These practices often influenced European bathhouses, especially in southern regions. The bathhouse also served a medical function. Physicians of the time often recommended bathing for various ailments. Warm water was believed to balance the humors, improve digestion, relieve melancholy, and encourage circulation. Bathhouses might be visited on the advice of a doctor, or simply as a way to ease sore muscles and cold limbs. Some people believed that certain baths, especially those fed by natural hot springs, had healing properties, and entire towns became known for their waters. But while the bathhouse was a space for cleanliness, it was also a space of vulnerability. People were naked. Conversations were candid. Social ranks, though not erased, were softened. A merchant might find himself beside a monk. A craftsman might soak his feet across from a scholar. In these steamy rooms where fog obscured sharp divisions, people saw one another more plainly. Stories were exchanged. Deals were made. Songs were sung. Some bathhouses were even known for serving food and drink, turning the experience into an afternoon event. Not everyone approved. The church, at various points in the Middle Ages, expressed concern about the moral dangers of communal bathing. In some regions, bathhouses gained reputations as places of temptation, where modesty and virtue were compromised. There were even attempts to shut them down, especially during times of plague, when disease was feared to spread through shared water or close contact. In some cities, bathhouses were regulated or taxed. Others were left to fall into decline, as concerns about sin and sickness overtook the perceived benefits. Still, for much of the medieval period, public bathing remained a valued and routine part of life. In smaller villages where bathhouses were rare or non-existent, people bathed in rivers, lakes, or large wooden tubs at home. Bathing at home was often limited by water access, privacy, and heating. It took time to fetch enough water from the well or stream, heat it over the fire, and then fill a tub. As a result, full-body baths were taken only occasionally, once a week, once a month, or on feast days. The rest of the time, people washed their hands, faces, and feet more regularly, using small basins or cloths soaked in warm water. Foot washing, in particular, was important. It was practical, especially in a time when people walked great distances and wore shoes that allowed dust and dirt to settle in. It was also spiritual. In Christian households, foot washing had symbolic meaning, tied to humility and service. On special occasions, such as Maundy Thursday, lords and nobles would wash the feet of the poor in imitation of Christ. But beyond its symbolism, it was a simple and effective way to feel clean and renewed. Hair washing was another occasional practice. Since hair was rarely cut short and could trap oils and dirt, people used combs regularly to clean and detangle it. Combing, in fact, was a daily habit, often done with care and attention. Hair might be washed with water and a mixture of herbs, or even fermented rye water. Women often covered their hair with veils or wimples to keep it clean longer, while men wore hats or hoods. Scalp hygiene was a matter of both health and social respectability. Children were bathed by their mothers, often in the same tub used for laundry or cooking. The water might not be perfectly clean, but it was warm and soothing. Infants were rubbed with oil or soft cloths and wrapped in clean linen to sleep. Elders, too, were tended to, bathed gently by family members when they could no longer manage it themselves. Despite all the effort involved, the desire to feel clean remained universal. A hot bath, a rinsed face, freshly combed hair, the scent of rosemary or juniper in the air, these were quiet pleasures that offered relief from the sweat, smoke, and toil of medieval life. They brought a moment of calm, a sense of dignity, a break from the burdens of labor. So while the medieval world may seem dark and dirty from a distance, its people strove, again and again, to push back against the grime. They found water, they shared heat, they scrubbed with sand and cloth and ash. They gathered in bathhouses, soaked their bones, and emerged a little cleaner, a little lighter. Cleanliness was not easy, but it was pursued, however imperfectly. It was woven into the rhythm of life, and sometimes it was even a joy. To the medieval mind, cleanliness was not merely a matter of physical upkeep. It was entangled with beliefs about health, morality, and the invisible forces that shaped human life. Long before the invention of the microscope or the discovery of germs, people believed that illness was caused not by invisible bacteria, but by bad smells, evil spirits, or an imbalance of the body's internal humors. And so, cleaning the home or the body was not just about removing dirt. It was about guarding the soul and protecting the family from unseen dangers that drifted through the air. Central to this worldview was the idea of miasma, the belief that foul odors carried disease. A stinking room, a pile of rotting food, or the musty air of a closed-off chamber wasn't just unpleasant. It was dangerous. People believed that these smells could cause fevers, plague, or madness. In a time when medical knowledge was limited and sudden death was common, anything that threatened health was taken seriously. The nose became a kind of warning device, a way to detect corruption in the world. If something smelled bad, it was assumed to be bad, and possibly deadly. To fight back against these foul smells, people relied on scent. Not the synthetic perfumes we have today, but natural, earthy, sometimes pungent materials drawn from gardens, markets, and forests. Herbs like rosemary, sage, lavender, and mint were bundled and hung from rafters. Flowers were scattered on floors. Resinous woods were burned to perfume the air. Sweet-smelling oils were dabbed on clothes or rubbed into wooden furniture. These weren't just decorations. They were protective barriers, meant to keep the home pure and the body safe. Sometimes, these efforts took on an almost ritualistic form. People would carry small objects called pomanders, tiny metal or wooden spheres filled with aromatic herbs, resins, and spices. These were worn around the neck or tucked into clothing, especially during times of illness. In crowded streets or marketplaces, one might raise a pomander to the nose to block out the corrupt air. Wealthier individuals had ornate versions made of silver or gold, containing exotic spices like cloves, cinnamon, or frankincense. But even the poor could carry a simple cloth sachet of dried mint or thyme for the same effect. Cleaning itself was also shaped by superstition. It wasn't just about removing physical mess, it was about maintaining balance in the household. A dirty home was thought to attract misfortune. Dust and clutter created disorder, which in turn might invite bad luck, illness, or even supernatural visitations. In some regions, it was believed that sweeping the floor at night could sweep away your family's prosperity. In others, spilling salt or breaking a dish while cleaning was seen as an omen of arguments or trouble. Certain days of the week were considered better for cleaning than others. Fridays and Sundays were often avoided, either due to religious observance or folk belief. Mondays or Wednesdays might be preferred for larger tasks, while Saturday was often reserved for preparation, cleansing the home before the Sabbath or before a feast day. These rhythms gave structure to the week and helped families maintain a consistent pattern of care. Religious practices also reinforced the connection between cleanliness and morality. In Christian households, cleanliness was linked to spiritual purity. The phrase "cleanliness is next to godliness," while not from the Bible, reflected a deeply held belief that a well-kept home and a clean body were signs of virtue. Monasteries, which placed a high value on order and discipline, often maintained strict routines of sweeping, washing, and airing out bedding. Cleanliness, for monks and nuns, was part of their devotion. Even in humble peasant homes, preparing the home for Sunday, washing hands, putting on clean clothes, sweeping the hearth, was a kind of spiritual preparation, a gesture of reverence. In times of crisis, such as during the outbreak of plague, these beliefs took on even greater urgency. People fled the city air for the countryside, convinced that bad smells in crowded places were spreading the disease. Homes were fumigated with smoke from burning herbs. Incense was used during funerals and even carried through towns in processions meant to purify the streets. Fear heightened every instinct for cleanliness, turning each sweep of the broom and each scented candle into a form of prayer against the invisible enemy. Yet, despite the fear and superstition, there was also a deep sensory pleasure in these practices. A freshly aired room, with sunlight streaming through an open shutter and the scent of rosemary rising from the floor rushes, must have felt like peace itself. A head of hair combed with oil-slick fingers, a basin of warm water splashed on the face after a dusty day, a clean linen tunic laid out in the morning. All of these small acts carried a quiet joy. They reminded people that even in a harsh, uncertain world, there was a space, however small, where order and comfort could still exist. Even illness had its rituals of cleanliness. When someone was sick, the house was often cleaned more thoroughly. Bedding was washed, floors swept, windows opened, not just to remove dirt, but to restore balance. As the patient recovered, the home itself recovered too. regaining its rhythm, its scent, its warmth. There was a kind of healing in the cleaning, a belief that both body and space needed to be renewed together. And so, throughout the Middle Ages, the home became a kind of living body in its own right. It breathed with the wind, warmed with the hearth, and fell ill or healed depending on the care it received. Cleaning was not just maintenance. It was a dialogue between people and their environment, between the seen and the unseen. A fight not just against filth, but against fear, chaos, and darkness. In this way, medieval people, though without microscopes or mops, were not so different from us. They sought to live in spaces that felt safe, sacred, and clean. They trusted their senses. They followed old wisdom. And in every sweep of ash, every bundle of herbs, every basin of warmed water, they were trying to make a home in a world that often felt wild. They were trying to bring a little light into the shadows, a little freshness into the still air, a little peace into the day's end.